Welcome to the North Carolina State Medical Response System Initial Training Program for the State Medical Assistance Team. This presentation covers Module 6, Deployment Readiness. We should start with some objectives. First, today we will describe the SMAT Pre-Deployment Readiness and Planning process, describe personal pre-deployment readiness items essential to SMAT membership and deployment, discuss deployment notification and mobilization, describe SMAT member deployment types and relevant logistical support, and describe austere environments related to SMAT operations. We will also describe post-deployment and demobilization procedures. In addition to starting with objectives, we like to start every presentation with a safety note. Yes, you are taking this presentation online. However, we want you to keep in the back of your mind that there are some important considerations. These are relevant to the environments you may be deployed to and can include extremes of heat and cold, high winds, and all levels of rain. Additionally, you should prepare for less than ideal living quarters, as well as a lack of supplies and amenities you may typically be accustomed to. Remember, situational awareness is also very important during any training or deployment. Finally, while North Carolina may be our primary response area, we should always be ready to assist our neighbors. This module focuses on preparing SMAT team members for deployment. As a responder, you will have two readiness areas on which to focus your efforts: personal readiness and team member readiness. Personal readiness involves preparing your family for a potential emergency and for your absence. The other area is team membership readiness. This involves ensuring that you are prepared to function effectively as soon as you receive the alert. While many SMAT members will be quote-unquote emergency response veterans and will already be aware of the nuances of living and working in a field environment, this module primarily targets those who have never been on a deployment before. Responders should ensure their own basic needs are addressed before they can be expected to meet the needs of others stricken by a disaster. Paramount in meeting these needs is to ensure the health and safety of your family. In the face of a disaster, your family may experience some of the same trials and tribulations as other victims. In order to focus and perform to the best of your abilities, you must first ensure your family is safe and that their needs are being met during the deployment. One method of assisting in ensuring their safety is to develop a family disaster plan. Websites such as ready.gov and readyresponders.org are available to help responders prepare themselves and their family for deployment. In formulating a family disaster plan, SMAT members must first identify the risks their community might face. Second, they must develop plans that specifically address the needs of their family members. If you have a participant manual, it has a longer list of important family disaster planning elements, but some of the highlights include a checklist detailing essential tasks, roles, and responsibilities for each family member during a family mobilization to a disaster, considerations for food and water, clothing, supplies like flashlights and batteries, personal medications, essential records, and cash. The best preparation for a disaster is to educate yourself and all family members about the potential disruptions caused by a disaster. A family meeting is an excellent way to begin the process and will allow a team approach to the planning process as well as family activity time. Discuss the various dangers your community and your family might face and reinforce the reason you need to prepare. Develop this plan as a family team and keep the plan as simple as possible. During this time, it is important to reassure your family that their safety is paramount and that these planning measures are designed to ensure their safety during a disaster. This is also a time to educate your family on your potential role as an emergency responder and to validate their support for that role during a potential deployment to a disaster. In our extremely mobile society, It is not unusual for family members to be at multiple locations at the same time. One of the key elements of your plan should be to establish a family rally point where family members can meet once a disaster occurs. Ideally, each family member will have knowledge of at least 2 places to assemble that are readily accessible. These sites should also be specified in your family disaster plan, along with directions or maps if needed. Planning should start with the basics and focus on issues such as home emergencies like a fire, and build to more complex situations such as an evacuation of the family during an impending flood. A number of technological solutions may be helpful adjuncts to your family during this planning process. For example, knowledge of evacuation routes and access to map information may be assisted via items such as GPS units or even most cell phones these days. Additionally, battery-operated portable radios provide significant amounts of information and warnings. Another key element for family disaster planning is to ensure that you have developed a means for family members to connect with each other if they are separated. One method to reconnect family members is to identify an out-of-town or out-of-area family member or friend to be a mutual point of contact for all family members. Make sure all family members have the full contact information, like phone numbers, physical address, and email addresses for this individual, as well as for each other. The American Red Cross also offers a program called Safe and Well, where family members can either search for loved ones or they can register themselves as safe and well following a disaster. Information on this can be found by Googling Safe and Well or by contacting 866-GETINFO or 1-866-GET-INFO. As a team member, you are expected to have ready at all times your personal equipment, which includes clothing and personal items you will need for a deployment. An example packing list is contained in the supplemental materials section of the course manual. Additionally, there is a supplemental presentation that covers the differences between a 24-hour bag and a 72-hour bag, and offers some packing considerations and examples. While these lists and supplemental material may not be all-inclusive, they serve as a guide to the personal items that will help to address your personal needs in a disaster setting, and may be modified to meet your personal preferences. Veteran team members may have additional suggestions about additions, deletions, or substitutions for this list and serve as an excellent resource for the novice responder. The use of occupation-specific personal equipment for SMAT deployment is an important consideration for personnel being deployed. Each SMAT member must inform the team leadership if he or she has special equipment requirements. This is important because team leadership, logistics, and safety personnel must be aware of all equipment required for effective SMAT deployment. Each item will need to be evaluated for deployment and its relationship to safety, the need for service, storage, and portability. As a general rule, all SMAT equipment should be standardized and pre-approved prior to deployment. Specific equipment needs should be identified in a timely manner to facilitate processing, approval, and procurement if deemed appropriate. Responders should ensure that they have an ample supply of their current medications and medical supplies should they have underlying medical conditions when they deploy. It is recommended that responders carry at least 7 days' worth of medications. It is best to carry medications to last at least twice the number of anticipated days of the deployment. Responders should also carry copies of medication lists on their persons and in their deployment bags at all times. They should also make the team leader and safety officer aware of their underlying medical conditions or physical limitations. It is important that each SMAT member be compliant with all health and safety records requests by the SMAT leadership and management. They are responsible for workforce protection and may have a need to know about the status of SMAT members for their role in maintaining team safety and maintaining a healthy workforce during field deployments. An important part of workforce protection and personal safety is being current on immunizations. Being current on immunization status as an SMAT member is important for deployment field sites, geographic risks, and disease management situations you will likely encounter. Specific recommendations for SMAT member vaccinations should be discussed with SMAT leadership and management. Prior to receiving any immunization, each should be discussed with your primary care physician, as there are potential contraindications for nearly all vaccines, depending on an individual's health status and medical history. Requirements for immunization are listed in the MOU between the North Carolina Office of EMS and participating hospitals involved in the SMRS SMAT activities. They are listed below. The tetanus vaccine within the last 10 years. Hepatitis B vaccine or a positive titer within the last year. TB skin testing or a chest x-ray if the TB skin test is positive within the last year. This applies to all team members for a deployment. However, if there are special circumstances in the deployment setting or additional risks, additional immunizations may be required. It is important that each SMAT member complete the requisite training sessions related to equipment fit testing, sizing, and maintenance if personal protective equipment is going to be a requirement as part of your job performance. The SMAT management and leadership must be assured that SMAT members are ready to operationally deploy and have taken reasonable precautions to assure workforce protection. The ability to properly use SMAT equipment is an important part of this operational readiness and will need to be supported by a training and equipment doctrine throughout the duration of the SMAT deployment. As discussed in a prior module, the North Carolina Emergency Management Act of 1977 indicates that healthcare workers and EMS are regarded and defined as quote-unquote emergency management workers within the provisions of that act, and that they are entitled under North Carolina statute to the right to take leave without pay to assist in a disaster. As a team member, it is essential that you have this discussion with your employer prior to a deployment. It is imperative to enlist your employer's support prior to an actual notification and deployment to allow for cross-coverage and backfill of your position or job. If you are an independent practitioner, you must have made arrangements with your associates to cover your practice or position while you are gone. If you are unsure how to approach this subject with your employer, see one of your SMAT team leaders, as most of them are excellent at facilitating this discussion between you and your employer. For many SMRS and SMAT responders, the operational field environment is foreign to their daily activities. For example, responders who work in health professions may function daily in a climate-controlled environment. These responders are not exposed to a variety of environmental elements and are generally safe, warm, and dry. During a deployment, they will be in field conditions that lack many of the comforts generally taken for granted. They will face environmental issues such as heat stress or inclement weather. To that end, it is important that SMAT members maintain an elevated state of physical and mental readiness for duty. SMAT participants have requirements set forth in the prospective Memorandum of Understanding with the North Carolina Office of EMS and agree to make personal health and training records for all members available for review by the state agency when requested. Operations in a field environment require both physical and mental stamina. As an SMAT team member, you will participate not only in healthcare operations and patient decontamination procedures, but also in base camp operations. These activities will require the deployment and storage of shelters and the movement of materials on and off of the M8 trailer system. These activities require physical exertion, and it is important for each emergency responder to be aware of his or her functional limitations. In preparation for deployment, responders should take all necessary steps to protect themselves from potential illness, injury, and exposures. Responders with prior medical conditions, such as diabetes, cardiac issues, or pulmonary disease, should be aware that exposure to a field environment may place them at risk for an exacerbation of their underlying medical conditions. While there is no educational course or amount of training that can fully prepare the responder for the mental aspects of disaster response, the responder can be aware of some of the physiological, behavioral, and cognitive responses commonly encountered during a disaster. A disaster is a form of traumatic event and has been defined by the American Psychiatric Association as a life-threatening situation that evokes feelings of intense fear, horror, or helplessness. All of these elements surrounding a disaster produce stress not only for those directly affected by the disaster, but also for the responders. Responders may develop and exhibit many of the same signs and symptoms of stress that the victims exhibit, and may experience both the short and long-term effects of stress and grief. Consequently, no one, responder or victim, is unaffected by a disaster. The Centers for Disease Control lists the following as common human reactions and adaptations to a disaster. First, most people pull together and function during and after a disaster, but their effectiveness is diminished. Second, mental health concerns exist in aspects of preparedness, response, and recovery. Third, disaster stress and grief reactions are quote-unquote normal responses to an abnormal situation. Fourth, survivors respond to active, genuine interest and concern. Fifth, disaster mental health assistance is often more practical than psychological in nature. For example, offering someone a phone, distributing coffee, listening, encouraging, and reassuring and comforting them are much more beneficial than most other forms of mental health assistance. Last, disaster relief assistance may be confusing to disaster survivors, and they may experience frustration, anger, and feelings of helplessness related to disaster relief programs, and may reject disaster assistance of all types. Be patient with them. Stress from a disaster can affect responders in many different ways, and it's not uncommon for responders to experience stress in these ways. It is important to note some of the signs of stress that are commonly seen in disaster responders and to check yourself and teammates for possible signs of concern. For this presentation, we have broken those signs into behavioral, cognitive, and physiological responses. Some of the behavioral and emotional responses and symptoms may include anxiety or fear, grief, guilt, self-doubt, sadness, irritability, anger, resentment, increased conflicts with friends and family, hopelessness, despair, depression, or being overwhelmed, anticipation of harm to self and to others, or isolation, insomnia, gait change, hypervigilant, or easily startled, crying easily, gallows humor, or ritualistic behavior. Cognitive responses or symptoms may include memory loss, calculation difficulties or decision-making difficulties, confusion in general, or confusing trivial issues with major issues, concentration problems, reduced attention span, or preoccupation with the disaster, as well as recurring dreams or nightmares. Finally, physiological responses or symptoms may include fatigue, nausea, fine motor tremors, tics, paresthesia, profuse sweating, dizziness, GI upset, heart problems or palpitations, choking, or smothering sensations. Mental health issues in a disaster can affect everyone. For responders, having awareness of the psychological demands of disasters can improve their ability to deal with the stress. Good coping skills, self-care, and stress management techniques can allow the responder to manage the stress and grief from a disastrous situation. For team leaders, it is important to schedule organized status updates with team members on a regular basis. During these group events, the opportunity should be taken to discuss new and unexpected events impacting the deployment. Identify any responders who may be developing and/or exhibiting signs of stress, and make appropriate arrangements to refer the responder for appropriate debriefing and treatment. This slide identifies some of the self-care techniques disaster responders can use to mitigate the amount of stress they are being exposed to. Physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and spiritual techniques are all very important. You may choose to use the ones listed on the slide or develop your own to help manage stress while you are deployed. The module devoted to SMRS overview and history depicts SMRS levels of activation in more detail. It is essential that each SMAT member understand the method by which notification will occur throughout various levels of SMRS activation. Typically, SMAT leadership will receive advisory information detailing a potential deployment and prior to the alert phase. The SMRS will have the following phases of activation. First will be the alert or notification phase. Second should be the activation phase, and finally the demobilization phase. Mobilization may actually be concurrent with the alert phase depending on the nature of the emergency response. As you recall, ServNC, the online registration system for medical and health responders for the state of North Carolina, may be activated by the North Carolina Office of EMS at the request of local, regional, or state authorities such as the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. The notification process will occur through ServNC, call trees, and electronic notifications inquiring about the responder's availability, and will provide the responder with information about the assembly time and place and other pertinent deployment information. The responder should have situational awareness of impending weather events and anticipate the potential for deployment. Depending on the nature of the event, different levels of response may be anticipated. If this is a notice event, the deployment might be to establish and staff a casualty collection point, pre-situate a mobile surge facility, or provide triage and medical support to a state medical support shelter. The same would hold true for an activation to pre-stage for a planned event. In a no-notice incident, the SMRS and SMAT may be called upon to provide the same activities as listed for a notice event, but also may have to provide a forward decontamination service as well as a forward casualty collection point or scene triage and treatment. Examples of notice events include pre-planning in support of a hurricane or mass gathering event with a period of lead time. However, no-notice incidents or events might include things that offer little to no lead time to pre-plan for the response to include the resources needed. Such incidents might include a tornado strike, a catastrophic failure of utilities serving a medical facility, a terrorist event, large-scale transportation incident, or an industrial event. In a prolonged deployment, SMAT members may be relieved by other SMAT members not initially involved in the response, other state-based SMRS units, or by federal teams from the National Disaster Medical System. This also brings up a quick note about team logistics. The SMRS system and the SMATs are designed to be self-sufficient with logistical supplies such as food, water, medications, consumable medical equipment, etc. for 72 hours. The North Carolina Office of EMS, working in conjunction with local and state Division of Emergency Management offices, will provide logistical support and resupply to the deployed units if the deployment lasts for longer than the 72 hours, or if on-hand supplies are expended prior to that 72-hour time frame. It is important for team members to understand that in an austere environment, Even the resupply of minor items will require a coordinated logistical response. Sometimes SMATs are not deployed because the request is for equipment or materials rather than personnel. This is a logistical support mission. For example, generators, AC units, or ventilators are warehoused by SMATs and may be requested by another facility that has lost power. What is an austere environment? The concept of an austere environment was introduced in a prior module where it was noted that providing clinical services in an austere environment is expected of SMAT members. An austere environment, as it relates to SMAT, is akin to working in primitive conditions without the normal supplies or facilities usually available to provide medical services. In other words, the supporting health infrastructure may be severely damaged or even destroyed. Other non-medical factors will present challenges to team members during a deployment. For example, living conditions for team members may be difficult depending on the nature of the event, particularly if vital sectors of the community have been devastated. Rarely would you respond to a devastated region and find an intact motel, hotel, or dormitory. SMAT members may find themselves in communal living arrangements located in remaining buildings or in temporary structures such as our tent system. Responders should mentally prepare themselves for a general lack of privacy and space to which they are typically accustomed. Part of this type of communal environment may involve the use of field hygiene facilities, like showers or latrines. Restroom facilities may include a portable toilet, an improvised facility, or some other field expedient arrangement. It is also likely that laundry services may not be available. The responder should most definitely expect challenges from nature, like wind, water, heat, and cold, and should prepare all personal gear to match the season and expected climate conditions. This slide covers important environmental considerations and concerns for the SMAT team member. These environmental factors are covered in greater detail in the Responder Health and Safety module. However, we want to hit heat stress again here. Heat stress is a far more common factor affecting deployments since the majority of FEMA-declared disasters have occurred in the warmer months of the year. During these deployments, responders are particularly prone to heat exhaustion and dehydration and need to be closely monitored. It is important to note that thirst is a poor and often late sign of dehydration. Many factors affect a person's recognition of being thirsty, and as heat-related illnesses progress, symptoms such as nausea, headache, etc. may actually override the sensation of thirst. Tracking how concentrated your urine has become is one method to monitor your fluid status. However, some medications like multivitamins and diuretics may alter urine color. Know what your normal color is. And for reference, we've included this handy slide from the University of Maryland. You may also see this in the form of cards around or posters around most deployment sites. Demobilization is the final phase of most deployments. Typically, the deployed SMRS or SMAT team will perform its mission for up to 7 days. However, there are exceptions and the assignment could be lengthened or shortened depending on the mission and availability of personnel. The team commander will receive official notification from NCOMS and will begin the operation to end the deployment and to leave the assets for use by a replacement unit if the mission has not been completed. Team members will be notified on site at a daily briefing and informed of the withdrawal plan so they may begin preparations. Demobilization is the process in which the team that has completed its mission is being recalled from the mission. This process accounts for all personnel and resources and may involve additional planning to effectively get the team and assets to the home base. This process involves safety concerns, logistics, planning, and the command staff. An ICS Form 221, or the Demobilization Checkout, may be a useful document to help guide the process. At the time of the official notice of demobilization, the team will begin the process of ending the mission by striking the base camp, inventorying and packing the equipment, and traveling back to home station for debriefing. Generally, the team will demobilize and travel to the home station together. After arrival at home, the team will resupply and repair or replace any non-operational equipment and make ready for another deployment. A key element of deployment is to conduct an after-action debriefing to discuss any issues that were encountered during the deployment, create a corrective action plan, and execute that plan. In summary, this module focused on many essential elements for deployment readiness. This includes action items relevant to pre-deployment, deployment, and post-deployment. It includes considerations for personal readiness, including physical, mental, and emotional preparedness, and the development of a family disaster plan. Team members should be aware of the challenges of working in an austere environment. Demobilization will include such tasks as maintenance, repair, restocking, and replacement of all field deployed equipment, and is vital to continued SMAT readiness. Finally, SMAT members need to be aware that a call to duty may involve austere environments and exposure to types of disasters that are both common and uncommon to North Carolina. Don't forget to check out the supplemental lecture on your deployment equipment